Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I am Zsuzsa Cserg, Director of Virtual vASN, and I'm here to welcome everyone to our special panel about this disastrous war, the unprovoked attack that the Russian government is conducting against Ukraine. vASN is a scholarly association with membership and academic interest in both Ukraine and Russia. And we stand together with other professional organizations that have openly condemned the Russian state's violence and invasion into Ukrainian sovereign territory. You can find our statement about this on the vASN website. Today's special panel was organized and will be moderated by Dominique Arel, Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Ottawa, who is also a former president of vASN and the current director of vASN's annual convention. I will give the virtual floor to Dominique Arel in a second. Let me just remind our audience that we use the chat field for posting our panelists' short bios. We also use it for posting recommended literature. And we are using the Q&A field for questions from the audience. Please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A field anytime. Dominique, the floor is yours.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Zsuzsa. And thanks to all. I see that we have a fairly large audience in these very unsettling times. Let me make two quick points before we get on with the panel. The first is that vASN celebrates its 50th year of existence. It was founded in 1972, and so was the journal, Nationalities Papers. But the point I want to make is that vASN was essentially founded by Ukrainian emigres who fled the annexation of Western Ukraine in World War II. And the founder name was Stepan Horak. And these were emigres that generally were shunned by academia, certainly mainstream academia, seen as politicized and so forth. But they were the backbone of the association. They and two individuals, Henry Hottenbach, who fled Nazi Germany in 1933 as a German Jew, who became the first editor and the longtime editor of Nationalities Papers, and Michael Rifkin, who was born in what was then known as Vilnius now, but 1925 in Poland, and happened to be in Kiev in June 1941, the last time Ukraine was under massive full-scale invasion. And his family, his father, managed on his own to evacuate the family to Central Asia. And Michael Rifkin is 96 years old and still sits on the vASN board and will be at the vASN convention in May. So I wanted to make these connections with what we've been observing and experiencing and for the last week and the history of vASN. The second point is that we're working on multiple events. This should be a great event, and we'll have another one fully on Monday. Everything will be confirmed tomorrow, where all the speakers will be from Ukraine right now. That is, from cities that are currently besieged by the Russian army in Ukraine. So kind of a sequel of events. But let's focus on this event. So I'm very pleased to be chairing, and then I'll have a few words to say at the end before we move to the Q&A. So we will go in the following order. Marlene Laruelle from Georgetown University will go first, then Sam Greene from King's College, UK, then Keith Darden from American University in DC, Tanya Lokot from Dublin City University in Ireland, and me from University of Ottawa in Canada. And we will limit ourselves to 10 minutes each, and that should give us at least 30-40 minutes for what should be a pretty intense discussion. And as Zsuzsa indicated, please put your questions in the Q&A as you go along, and then we'll cluster them during the Q&A. Marlene, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Dominique. I would like to begin by just saying that I think we are all experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance about both what we're facing, having to speak in and trying to make a kind of academic sense of what is going on, and at the same time observing what is going on. So please bear with me on the way I'm trying to make my analysis. I would like to begin our discussion by looking at Russia's decision and trying to, so I have 2 points. The first one is the kind of more conceptual issues about how we will have now to discuss Russia's dramatic choice and the fact that it has kind of cut other options. And so my first point is really about the issue of the multiplicity of futures and options that Russia had until it made that decision. And one of my concern is the kind of growing narrative that I see emerging about the unavoidability of the war, and this idea that it was kind of written in the DNA of the Russian regime that it would go to war with Ukraine. And I think it's put us at risk of looking back retrospectively over the last 22 years of Putin's reign with the eyes of today. And so I think that's analytically false to project what Russia is doing now into the past, because it's kind of hiding the existence of option. I think the disaster was not predetermined from the beginning. The war was only one option among many other, and Russia could have chosen a less confrontational future until a few weeks ago. And I'm saying that because it's important on the way we want to try to understand how the decision was made in Russia. And I see this existence of option in the really change of narrative between the December claims that Russia, so the text that Russia proposed to the US and to NATO to sign, and the two speeches of Putin in February. The December texts are much more focused about Russia's strategic demand, about reorganizing the European security architecture. We may agree, disagree, but it's legitimate elements on which you can sit at the table of negotiation and try to see what you can do. The February speeches are on a totally different dimension. The genocide, the denazification, the narrative about Ukraine being a kind of Bolshevik construction, not only it's, of course, historical lies, but it's also saying something that is absolutely primordialist and kind of essentialist about Ukraine not existing or not being legitimate as a state and as a nation. And so in a sense, it's a shifting the Russia's narrative from something that was transactional, do we want NATO expansion or not, to something where, well, it's no more a transaction. There is really nothing to discuss if it's about an essentialist claim about the legitimacy of the existence of Ukraine or not. And I say that's because here also, I think this kind of retrospective vision of Russia that would have been ready to go to war and to deny Ukraine's existence since the arrival of Putin, I think it's wrong also in terms of policy decision, because it's give the idea that policy decisions don't have impact either in provoking tension or in deterring them. And here I want to make an argument, and I know it's difficult to hear for many people here, but I think it's important to dissociate the strategic deadlock and the war. The war is a unilateral decision taken by a small group of people, if not by Putin alone, and there is only one aggressor, and I think there is no discussion on that. The strategy deadlock is something much more complicated, and on that, I think the West is a co-creator on some aspect of the strategic deadlock that we had, and that's where I mean, it's difficult it's important, I think, to try to disentangle the war and its kind of unilateral aggressor and the deadlock where you have a multiplicity of actors who probably each of them contributed to the deadlock. And my vision is that the West has kind of co-created that by being unable to envision or to imagine a situation where Ukraine wouldn't have to choose. And so we have been sending mixed messages to Ukraine and to Russia. And so my main concern now is that the Ukrainian societies, I put so much hope in trying to understand if they were in or out the West, that I'm really afraid of a big disappointment to come, and the feeling of having been betrayed by the West, depending on how things will evolve. And there will be a day where people will have to sit at the table of negotiation. And that moment, I'm afraid of a big disappointment. So all that to say that I think these issues of trying to see the importance of keeping in mind that there are several options, that there were several options is important. My second point is that the kind of the myth-making process of Russian foreign policy and how much it has accelerates. For me, what I see is really a shift in the ability of the regime to keep the balance between its strategic interest in kind of confronting the West normative influence and the ideological project that always has been accompanying Russian foreign policy action. And I really see a kind of increasing myth-making production. If you compare the narrative of 2008 intervention in Georgia, there was already the narrative about the genocide of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It was there. 2014, of course, the mythologization of Crimea. But if you remember the myth of Novorossiya, the state was able to retake control of this ultra-radical nationalist kind of a blossoming moment over the Novorossiya concept quite quickly over a few months, and trying to kind of putting them back in line that were kind of under the umbrella of what the state was considering as its strategic interest. After 2014, I think we have a really fast acceleration of this entanglement between history and security. And as you may know, the main figures of the security services, being Patrushev, Bortnikov, people like Narishkin, all have duties in history management, right? From the Russian military history to the Russian geographical societies. And so that's really a moment where this entanglement became so difficult, probably for the creator themselves to realize what was the mythical part and how it could serve the strategic interest, and Putin's own articles on the history of the Second World War and the second article on the unity between Russian and Ukrainian people. So I think what has been happening is there was a managed myth-making process that was pretty well subordinated to more pragmatic and state-centric strategic interests. And it seems now the dynamic has been reversed, and that ideological beliefs now seems to have shaped some of the strategic decisions. So in a sense, the imaginary, the projective, the fictional part of each nation building has become weaponized in the most literal sense of being now a literal weapon of destruction. Two very brief comments. One is on the place of the Holocaust theme in what is happening now. Russia a few years ago has made a really fascinating turn about reintegrating Holocaust in its narrative and its legitimation, trying its legitimizing narrative about being the anti-fascist power. As you know, the Holocaust was never central in Russian historiography of the Second World War, and we could see this effort of trying to make that create a more coherent narrative where Russia would suddenly become a kind of big defensor of the Holocaust memory. Russia was also building links with Israel around that, trying to push away, of course, the Central Eastern European countries in this memory war. And all that got totally destroyed now with the ridiculous denazification of Ukraine claim, with what happened to Babi Yar yesterday or 2 days ago. So all these elements that were really fascinating, I think, in the memory construction of Russia is now, I think, totally out. And my last comment, and I will stop after on that, is on the place of the geography of territory, of space in Russia's projection. And here also I see a shift. I think for long, restoring Russia's greatness in Putin kind of long-term objective, and that I think that long-term objective was always there since the 1999 manifesto. It was not necessarily meant to be reconquering lost territories. I think for very long, Russia or the Kremlin was able to imagine its great power in today's frontier, in having soft power abroad, in having a kind of much more modern way of managing what great power can mean. And I think Surkov was much more subtle than that. And then we have seen progressively this kind of crystallization around, or crispation around the idea of sphere of influence, a buffer zone. And so now what we have, I think, is a kind of complicated mess where it's unclear if Ukraine shouldn't exist because it's part of imperial history. In that case, it's about reintegrating imperial history, if it's a kind of frozen conflict method. And I think all the ambiguities we have seen about Donetsk and Lugansk, is that a recognition, is that an annexation? Even Narishkin couldn't make it clear as he was so anxious. Or is that creating Ukraine as a kind of Eastern Bloc country type that would be under Russia's political domination? So I think there have been a change on the way Russians understand the spatial geographical projection of its great powerness, and that has kind of accelerating the decision of invading Ukraine and launching the war. I will stop here on this very general feature and give the floor to Sam.
Thank you, Sam. You have the floor.
Thank you, Dominique, for the invitation, and to Marlene for kicking us off, but also saying a lot of really important things. And I want to pick up on one of them in particular, although all of them were incredibly thought-provoking. Marlene, you said something very important about sort of not aggregating together, or in fact disaggregating, right, what we're seeing. Right? And I think that there's a tendency in times like these, and when we have big shocks to our systems, both our political and our social systems that we live in as human beings, but also the things that we analyze as social scientists, right? To suddenly, first of all, see everything that's happening, right, around this phenomenon, whether it's this war, right, or the election of Trump, or Brexit, or the end of the Soviet Union. We did this a lot in the end of the Soviet Union. To see this as a single phenomenon, right, and everything that's happening around as somehow intrinsically part of that phenomenon, and then to look for an explanation, right, for that set of phenomena as a whole, rather than to disaggregate it. And I think that's dangerous for a couple of reasons, at least. One, building on what Marlene said about the danger of projecting these explanations forward, right? We then tend to often project them backwards. We then tend to project them forward, right? Particularly when we're giving advice to policymakers, or policymakers are trying to interpret what we as social scientists say, right? And that can lead to some really problematic assumptions. But also because I think it leads us into a territory of pretending that we can come up with answers for everything. Right. And as social scientists, maybe I'm giving myself an out here because I got a lot of stuff wrong, right, in this situation, and I'll talk about that in a second, right? But as social scientists, we generally recognize, particularly, when we do mathematical models of human behavior, right, that we are explaining relatively small portions of the variation in that human behavior, right? But when we face a crisis like this, right, I think we tend to look for an explanation for all of it. Right. It makes us feel better, and it makes the people we talk to feel better. But often it ends up being wrong, right? And we need to become, in some cases, a little bit more comfortable with the fact that there's going to be things happen for which we're just not going to be able to come up with good explanations. Now, as I said a second ago, I was wrong, right? And I've been quite public about this. Graeme, Robertson, and I had a piece in the Washington Post back in December in which we said essentially that while war was a very real possibility, it would be ridiculous not to acknowledge that and not to prepare for it with a number of troops and material that were parked along the Ukrainian border. We didn't think it was likely, right? And we didn't think it was likely because we thought we had a model of political decision making, right, that incorporated what we knew, or at least what we thought we knew about how politics work in Russia, both the relationship between Putin and the elite, and the relationship between Putin, the elite, and the public. And we looked at the risks, and while it was clear that there was a lot of profits to be gained from the kind of confrontation that Russia was in with the West around Ukraine and around NATO and all these other things that were being put on the table, that any outcome of a war was likely to be a net loss, both for Putin and for Russia as a whole, right, compared to the situation that they were in before the war. Right. Clearly, again, we got that wrong, right? At least we got wrong our sense of the calculations as Putin would see them. I'm not going to try to get inside Putin's head. I usually show up in screens like this and say that's the one thing I will never do. Right? I don't feel comfortable there, and I'm not going to engage in that. But we do need to think about, right, what this means for Russian politics, right? What we might have gotten wrong about Russian politics. but also maybe some of the things that we've gotten right about Russian politics, right? So one of the things that I think we need to pay a bit more attention to, or maybe give a little bit more credence to, is the possibility of a causal relationship, right, between what goes on domestically and what goes on internationally, right? We know, and it's been true for a very long time, that the idea of an external threat has been a core legitimizing factor and rhetorical device, but also, frankly, an enforcement device in the restructuring of Russian politics that has been going on. I mean, frankly, you can date it at different points. I would date it from sort of 2004, the initial reaction to the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, provoking a reframing of opposition in Russia as inherently disloyal and connected with external interests, which then leads to a series of legislative changes in a series of sort of cat and mouse games between the Kremlin and the opposition, until we get to a point where, by the Duma elections in 2021, any kind of serious opposition is framed as treason, and frankly is increasingly prosecuted as treason. Again, before we get to war in Ukraine, before we get to 150,000 troops or whatever it was on the Ukrainian border, right? So this is a logic of internal politics, right? Within that, I think it was pretty clear that maintaining at least rhetorical confrontation with the West and with the US and NATO in particular was important, right? Because it justifies that stance, right? And it galvanizes public support for that stance, right? In a regime that is still not a totalitarian regime, still not able to coerce compliance out of whole cloth, and relies on sort of socially motivated compliance with its policies. So the question I think we have to grapple with, right, is, or one question I'm trying to grapple with at the moment at least, is there a causal relationship between the fact that we see the hardening and the increasing reliance on external threat as a factor of domestic politics, right? The fact that coexists in time with the materialization of conflict, right? Of physical, kinetic conflict with the West by proxy, at least as Russia sees it, in Ukraine, is that in fact a causal relationship? I don't have the answer to that question, but I think we have to take it seriously. I think we also have to take seriously, and this is not something I'm going to say much about because I haven't yet learned how to take it seriously methodologically, the role of ideas. Right? I think that most people like me who think of ourselves as comparative political scientists, right, we still we know how to take seriously the role of ideas when we're evaluating group behavior, when we're evaluating behaviors of societies or groups within societies. We can devise instruments for measuring that and trying to figure out the degree to which it's causally relevant. We're not, I think, equipped to do that at the moment when we're talking about behavior of individual leaders, certainly, right? And probably when we're talking about the behavior of elites as a whole, right? So I think we have often rather flippantly discounted the idea that Putin might be motivated by nationalism, or the people around him might be motivated by nationalism or by questions of identity in ways that maybe were not entirely justified. Right. So I think we need to take that a bit more seriously. In terms of things I think we've gotten right, however, right, the risks that we said should have pushed Putin off of this war, right, are materializing. And I think, broadly speaking, there's three of them, right? One of which is the war itself, right? War inherently has unpredictable outcomes and consequences. I'm not going to sit here and try to predict the outcome of the war, but I take seriously what we're hearing from both the military analysts and the intelligence community, that the war has not gone to plan, right? And that seems to be reflected both in the way it's being prosecuted and in the way that it is being discussed within Russia, right? So that was a risk that has materialized, and that the Kremlin is going to have to deal with. The second, related to that, is the sanctions risk and the economic risk, right? To try as they might to have said that that they were sanctions proof, or that they had the wherewithal to deal with what was coming. Sanctions have, broadly speaking, come harder and faster than I think most people would have expected. And again, indications from what we're hearing from around the policy community in Moscow is that they have come harder and faster than Moscow has anticipated, right? And that is beginning to create panics within sectors of the Russian economy, and sort of release the animal spirits that can become quite damaging. That is already having an impact, obviously, on public behavior. We've seen the queues outside of bank machines. We seem to be seeing panic buying, and we haven't even really hit yet the impact on prices, right, that this will inevitably have if the ruble remains as depressed as it is. The third thing, which I think really is the key thing here, is public opinion. Right? In the prosecution of the war,
In your
we
last
have
minute.
not yet seen, I think we
In your
are
last
beginning
minute,
to
Sam,
see,
right?
unfortunately,
Minute.
we have not yet seen the war be prosecuted the way that we were afraid of. Right? And I think the key explanator for that is the unpreparedness of the Russian public for this war, and the unpreparedness of the Kremlin to justify the sorts of pictures that are beginning to come out of Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Kiev, increasingly, unfortunately, to that Russian public. Right? We can get into this in the Q&A. For someone who's been wrong, I've talked way too much, so I'll stop.
Thanks so much, Sam. And now we'll move to Keith.
It's not a vice to be wrong, Sam. It's only a vice to be wrong and not change your views. So always good to keep that in mind. I want to sort of follow up on what Marlene and Sam have been saying with regard to Russian motivations. And I do think nationalism and identity, and the way in which, I will get into Putin's head, and the way in which he thinks about what constitutes the homeland that he is responsible for and needs to defend, plays a very important role in why he invaded Ukraine, and can also give us some insight into why they are likely to persist, regardless of what are clearly going to be extremely high costs. So if you think about it from Putin's perspective, as he has articulated, as Marlene pointed out, in some very disturbing speeches in February, Kiev and Moscow were part of the same sovereign entity prior to 1991 for over 300 years, with a couple of wartime interruptions, right? That sovereign entity has gone by different names. It used to go by the name of the Russian Empire, and then it went by the Soviet Union. But that entity is clearly his point of reference. In other words, that is the country that he thinks of as kind of the homeland territory, what he thinks of as Russia, right? In the speech in February, he articulated how a conception of Ukraine was constructed and institutionalized under the USSR, which he saw clearly as a mistake, in part because he does see this broader entity as essentially a Russian entity, as Ukrainians as essentially Russian people, and for that reason, not NATO expansion alone, not sort of simple security concerns. I think that he accurately, in the sense of publicly articulated what his red line was, which was an anti-Russian government on Ukrainian territory. In other words, territory that he considers to be sort of part of a classic Russian homeland, that had a military relationship with the United States and the West. And that was considered to be intolerable. An independent Ukraine, perhaps, right? Just as he's tolerated an independent Belarus and an independent Kazakhstan and other areas that have significant Russian populations and were part of that sovereign entity when it was called the Soviet Union. He's comfortable with that, but not with a hostile government in power. And to the extent that that government, under both post-2014 leaders, both Poroshenko and Zelensky, was cutting away at ties to Russia, was pursuing language policies and sanctioning political leaders that were looking towards Russia, and who also seemed to think of the ties with the historic Russian Empire as being significant for them, of language and culture. To the extent that those governments worked to prune those ties to the East, those governments were considered to be threatening, to the point where he was very likely to intervene. I do take them at their word as well that Minsk implementation would have solved this problem. If you think about Minsk, it's primarily a way of a constitutional change in Ukraine that would have institutionalized Ukrainian geopolitical neutrality and a kind of political cultural pluralism within Ukraine because of some kind of federalism or confederalization. I understand why the Ukrainians did not implement it, but I think if they had, we probably would not have crossed Putin's red line that led to the intervention. That said, like Marlene, he intervened, and this was a decision on the Russian part. In other words, there are ways that it potentially could have been forestalled, but full responsibility for the crime of invading Ukraine entirely lies in the Kremlin. Okay, how is this different from 2014? I find it quite interesting in that narrative, the idea of Ukraine being, historic Russian lands and part of the homeland, had some resonance in 2014. It has no, within Ukraine, it has no resonance now. So in Ukraine in 2014, we actually saw a fair amount of defection from the Ukrainian military. So the head of the Ukrainian Navy joined the Russian Navy and became the deputy head of the Black Sea Fleet and brought most of Ukraine's ships with him and personnel, right? We saw former regime elements of the Yanukovych government in the Donbass genuinely opposing the government in Kiev and soliciting Russian support, right? And so we do see, in 2014, a fair amount of defection, a fair amount of local collaboration in places like Crimea and in the Donbass with Russian intervention. We see none of that now. At least, in the public view, there's no defection at all. The Ukrainian military has fought valiantly and fiercely. And so Ukrainians, while they still have these there is a high degree of pluralism within Ukraine about what the relationship to Russian culture should be and what the relationship to Russia would be. There is no pluralism about the desire to be occupied by the Russian Federation. In other words, there is complete homogeneity of opinion for all intents and purposes among the population at all levels, elite and mass, that this invasion is entirely unwanted and warrants popular resistance. Just a couple notes about Russian commitment as well. In other words, Putin has this kind of resolve based on a conception of the Russian nation that sort of goes back, hundreds of years, but his soldiers don't seem to have that resolve. And so I think we've seen a lot of unwillingness to prosecute this war at the infantry level, where you really do need soldiers to take initiative, and they've been very reluctant to do so, and that's somewhat heartening in this case. I think that it makes the prosecution of the war much more difficult. I do, however, think that the Russian military is like to be successful in its occupation of at least 2/3 of Ukraine, but successful only from a military battlefield sense. In other words, I think they're likely to take this territory, but we are likely to see resistance. Now, there was a lot of talk before the war about how AK-47 wielding babushki were gonna be like the IRA in the streets of Kharkiv. I don't think we're gonna see that kind of resistance. I think that kind of resistance usually in wartime dissipates over time and is highly terrain dependent. The motivations for that kind of thing are really held by only a small number of people. So I think that's likely to dissipate. But what I think we may see, and this is probably actually a more significant form of resistance, is an unwillingness to collaborate administratively with this occupation. And the Russian military doesn't have the administrative capacity to rule the territories that it has the military capacity to seize. And if we continue to see, as we have seen, the Ukrainian population rejecting collaboration, I think that this occupation may very well fail. And I think that tells us something about nationalism in some ways. In other words, Ukraine does have a variety of different identities. There is a stronger set of attachments to Russia in the south and east of the country. We see it in surveys, but that's a very different thing from wanting your sovereignty to be violently taken away by your neighbor. And that has triggered a response on the Ukrainian side that I think is likely to be fairly persistent in this case. And so in some ways, Putin may have lost the Ruski mir навсегда.
Thank you, Keith. And now we turn to Tanya.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you. And I think this is actually a really good segue to now maybe talk a little bit about the Ukraine side and their kind of position. And I think what I would like to focus on a little bit more is just to sort of talk about how they've been dealing with the war and the invasion, or this particular stage of the invasion that has now escalated immeasurably, and to some extent how they've been dealing with trying to figure out what sort of identity they should be communicating as a nation and as a people and as a government, and how they've been dealing with trying to take control over the information space, essentially, because I think this has been sort of hailed by many as a very successful attempt by Ukraine to take control of the information space, which is of course somewhat easy to do, when your enemy isn't really providing much information into your shared information space. And so I think in this sense, we can say that perhaps, Russia's kind of affinity for censorship and silence and not sharing anything and state secreting every available piece of data has perhaps played into Ukraine's hands, because if, like as we were saying before the panel, if you've spent any time on Twitter or any other social media platform, and if you're following the events, it's very clear that there is a lot more Ukraine generated content, both from government channels, from civil society, just ordinary citizens, journalists. There are foreign reporters on the ground in Ukraine and a lot of local Ukrainian reporters generating this content. And I think it's created this kind of avalanche of various points of view that, are in some way a bit chaotic, and there's a lot of information, but in some ways it's kind of an antidote to the kind of censorship and silence that the Russian side has been trying to instill with a bit of propaganda on the side, obviously. So, I think Ukraine has obviously, this kind of mobilization, both in terms of like government mobilization of the army and of the citizens, but also civic organizing and mobilization on the ground and across borders, is something that you think Ukraine has been cultivating as a kind of survival tactic, to a large extent ever since it became independent again after the fall of the Soviet Union, but especially since 2005 and later since 2014. As Ukrainians keep reminding people, the war didn't start on February 24th, 2022. The war started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the seizure of parts of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. So to some extent, the people who are doing this work now, whether it be coordinating resources, humanitarian aid, military assistance, or information resources, and getting people out, all of these networks have been in operation on some scale for years, and these civil society grassroots networks are really, really important because, as we say, trying to coordinate something on this scale, both in terms of resistance in the information sense and in the very material and logistical sense, is quite difficult. It's a large country. There are lots of different parts which are being attacked by different parts of the Russian forces. But there is a need to kind of materially create some sort of cohesion and have shared information from sources that people can trust. Also to create a shared kind of message or a shared tone that the country and its citizens would be projecting outside to external audiences, both in the West and in Europe, but also in Russia. And I think, despite the fact that, yes, there is a bit of chaos and that there is a bit of overlaps where different people try to do the same thing, but we are seeing those networks kind of going into overdrive and going into operation, and people begin to really coordinate who is doing what. So it's been really interesting, for somebody who watches this information space very closely, to see how people start to figure out the task distribution and to sort of understand that, well, it's really important for us to put out certain kinds of information to certain audiences, and not necessarily everybody needs to know everything. Citizens need to know, where to get food and water and medicines and how to get out, or, where and who to call. Governments and European Parliament members and other diplomats need to know other messages. But there is a sense that, there's kind of a shared pool of these messages that they're using to, as we say, inspire ordinary people to kind of, not give up, or, at least not to give in. And as we say, perhaps the mood isn't quite the same in every part of Ukraine. But despite this, we're seeing, a lot of evidence that people are actually, pro-Ukrainian. And not only are they pro-Ukrainian, they're also pro their government, because their government is regularly talking to them, which is really important, right? Putin makes appearances, but he talks to his minions. Zelensky makes appearances every night and every morning, and he talks to his people, which I think is really important. And it's really important for this conflict specifically. And so taking this control of the information space has also been really useful, because it's not only, it's multilingual, there are messages in multiple languages. There's a huge ton of work being done by, obviously, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also the Ministry of Digital Transformation, and so all of these, there are regular logistical messages and coordination and all of that stuff, but there's also this kind of side project on communicating facts, right? Regular updates with numbers, which, yes, casualties and kind of loss numbers aren't easy to verify by either side. But Ukraine's been very forthcoming with providing regular updates and using nice infographics and giving that kind of sense of transparency, which in this time, I think, is even more important than actual transparency. Having a sense of transparency is much more important, especially, as I said, when the other side isn't really sharing anything. I think today really was the first day when, Russian officials deemed to share any kind of numbers of losses on their side. Besides facts and evidence, there's also a huge role for emotional messaging. And sometimes that's also evidence, right? So like all these videos of captured tanks and whatnot, but also, actual evidence of soldiers and Russian troops being captured, but also with the message that, we want them to go back to their mom, doing all those kind of emotional affect-laden messages. I think that's also really important. It's important to create a certain image, of Ukraine and of the Ukrainian government as inherently, the messages that they've been sending is that we didn't want this war, we didn't start this war, we're in our own land, and it's very clear who the aggressor is here. And I think that's very, very important. It's also very important that there's been some attempts to fight disinformation, but mostly it's been sharing information proactively and then pre-bunking. We know the US has done this to some extent with sharing all those plans all the time. But I think the Ukrainians are trying to do this too. And so it's been interesting to see some of the kind of messaging, like saying you're going to see attempts at manipulation, you're going to see, people attempting to fake things, to record, whatever AI modified videos with Zelensky saying he's resigning. I think it's really important, and perhaps pre-bunking is actually more effective than debunking things after they happen. All the research we've done on fake news and disinformation tells us this much. So I think this control over the information space is incredibly important, also because it creates this sense of shared purpose and a sense of shared identity, where it doesn't really matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter if you're from Eastern Ukraine or Western Ukraine or North or South or Central. You're all part of a bigger something. You're part of a bigger mission, and that mission is basically to make sure your country is still standing. And I think it's been really interesting to see how they've tried as much as possible, obviously the kind of the strategic, the government officials who are kind of behind the campaign to create these information messages, but also the civil society, how they've tried to make it inclusive, you know, where they're not saying, we're not just talking about Ukrainians here, as in like ethnic Ukrainians. We're talking about everyone, right? Because Ukraine is a multi-ethnic nation. You've got the Greeks, you've got the Jews, you've got the Georgians, you've got the whoever's, you know, and you've even got ethnic Russians who are also supporting Ukraine because, you know, many of them live here and it's their homeland. And I think that's also been really effective because to some extent, you know, Russia is also a multi-ethnic nation. That Putin doesn't talk about it much, but it's true. So I think seeing this kind of acceptance that, you know, it's a nation with a national identity, but it's also a diverse nation has also been really effective. You know, so I think, yeah, just running up, yeah. So I think Ukraine has done really, really well, both in terms of using the information space to mobilize its own citizens, but also to mobilize what I would call interpretive agency, right? So they've taken over kind of their attempt. You know, they, I think, in my mind at least, they currently hold more power as to trying to interpret what this war is, whose fault it is that it's ongoing, you know, and that there are huge casualties. And, you know, the juxtaposition with everything else we're seeing from the Kremlin side and from the Russian side doesn't really create a very appealing image for, you know, of Putin or of the Kremlin or of the Russian officials, because the Ukrainian officials and the Ukrainian citizens and the Ukrainian activists and the Ukrainian military are looking much more attractive in the kind of conventional sense and much more rational also, but also more emotionally appealing. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tanya. So I will go. As we are watching in real time through the powerful tool of social media that Tanya just talked about, the catastrophe unfolding in Ukraine, I'd like to make 2 points, although mostly the first, or question of time probably. The first is about clarity, uncertainty. The second is about lack of clarity, fogginess, and terrible uncertainty. On the first point, historians have known for a long time that the idea that Ukrainians form a different nation than Russians and therefore decide of their own destiny is seen by Moscow and a large segment of the population as artificial, as a creation of foreign powers. In the 19th and earlier 20th century, that was Austria and Poland, the villains. Now it's the United States. We also know from histories that since World War II, Russia has associated Ukrainian nationalism, which I define here as the simple idea that I just laid out, that Ukrainians are distinct and have the right to self-determination, with fascism. So the association of Ukrainian nationalism with fascism. In this view, it is not merely the Ukrainian insurgents of World War II, they were alluded to, they call themselves the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, who are fascist. It is the very idea of Ukrainian nationalism that is fascist. What we did not know is that a Russian ruler would be willing to wage a full-scale war on this premise. When Putin tells us that the objective of the so-called military operation to protect Donbass is to, quote, denazify Ukraine, what he literally means is that a Ukrainian state that persists in aligning itself with the West, EU, NATO, and as Keith just put it, is seen as anti-Russian, so resisting Russian pressure, is nationalist, and therefore artificial and murderous, since the fascists kill civilians. This is the link between denazification and the absurd claim of genocide in Donbass. By the way, in real time, Russia legitimized its annexation, well, first its invasion of Crimea and then annexation, by using the threat of genocide. The whole NATO security angle that came later. In real time, it was also genocide. Putin is telling us that in order to stop the genocide in Donbass, we need to denazify Ukraine. Now, in plain English, this means not only overthrowing the government, but eradicating the very idea of Ukrainian nationalism. The state propagandists are loud and clear. Again, in real time, the goal, in very chilling tones, is to bring about a solution to the Ukrainian problem. Решение украинского вопроса. In this macabre view, the virus of Ukrainian nationalism and the fake Ukrainian state can be extirpated and the real Ukrainians will emerge. That was the essence of the Putin appeal to the Ukrainian generals last Friday. Basically, take care of the problem yourself, make a coup, and you will be well treated. Now, we are way past neutrality towards NATO. Russia now aims to destroy what it sees as the unreal Ukraine once and for all. Yet, we also got clarity and certainty, and that was mentioned before already in this event. We got clarity and certainty regarding the actually existing Ukraine. So before Maidan, Ukraine had been electorally divided between East and West. 2014 brought the clarity that a Russian-oriented social basis and street power could be found in the two territories with the highest concentration of ethnic Russians, namely Crimea and the core of the Donbass, the core urban Donbass, not the entire Donbass. The Russian-speaking Ukrainians of the East and South largely, massively identified with Ukraine. In 2022, the situation is even much clearer, far clearer. The Russian invasion has extinguished any visible social support for Russia in Ukraine. Basically treading on territory already explored by Keith here. Never thought we would see eye to eye so much. The imaginary Ukrainians applauding the Russian so-called operation don't exist. The opinion polls with caveats are still highly suggestive. 80% ready to take arms, 91% supporting Zelensky, and so forth. Putin aims to destroy the Ukrainian idea, and he has achieved the total opposites. Everybody is now Ukrainian in the sense of identifying with an independent Ukrainian state. We could almost say in social science terms, Ukrainian nation building has been completed. My second point, briefly, is about uncertainty. On the grounds, as we all know, the news are quite grim and we have to expect the worst. So the cities are encircled, the missiles are being launched at cities, killing civilians. Amnesty International has already compiled a dozen possible war crimes committed in indiscriminate attacks against civilians. We could see very soon food distribution breakdown in Kiev and elsewhere. With overwhelming military superiority, the prospect of the Russian military breaking the Ukrainian army is far from being implausible, despite the heroic efforts of Ukrainians. Western intelligence agencies are bracing for the worst outcomes. But no one knows with certainty. The sanctions have been considerably more formidable than expected. And we're at the point when the French economics minister yesterday literally called for the collapse of the Russian economy if the war goes on. Now, these severe economic strains could destabilize the Russian military. On the intangibles, and again, reiterating here points made before, the defenders, the Ukrainians, have high morale, but the aggressors, the Russian soldiers, don't, as they seem unprepared for what they're supposed to do. And the sudden avalanche of military aid, including from my own country here in Canada, could make a difference. But if we assume the worst and that the Russian army does take control of the large cities, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and so forth, at the cost of enormous civilian casualties because of large-scale urban warfare, what next? Now, we saw in World War II that every state has its collaborators. The classic case were Quisling in Norway, Vichy in France. Now, these collaborators believe in a Nazi-led project of a new Europe. There was an ideological basis to their actions. But what can potential Ukrainian collaborators believe in, since Russia is now waging war on the notion that the real Ukrainians are those who take direct orders from Moscow and accept, in a sense, the destruction of their country? I just can't imagine that even the Neo Party of Regions officials would go for that. Well, I know, well, it's pretty clear to me that they won't. They wouldn't. After all, even in 2014, the local Donbass Party of Regions stayed loyal to Kiev before being booted out by the men with guns. Even before the full-scale war, the Friday before the war, there was this almost surreal broadcast, the famous talk show by Slavik Schuster on Ukrainian TV, owned by the oligarch Akhmetov. And you had a whole repertoire of officials. Poroshenko was there, but so was the leader of the far-right Azov party, Andrei Biletsky, and on the Neo Party of Region side, the guy who was supposed, according to British intelligence, had a kind of a new Ukrainian government, Murayev. They were all there, basically, together. So it seems that imaginary Ukraine is so entrenched in Putin's mind that an endgame when faced with the real Ukraine does not exist. Judging by military operations, the aim appears to be taking control of Kiev and everything south and east of Kiev, which roughly correspond to the fantasized Russian world, Ruski Mir of Putin, leaving Western Ukraine. But how can the Russian military be expected to rule without social support? Keith said it already. The brutal invasion having extinguished the legitimacy of the Russian project. And how can Western Ukraine be expected to remain quiet? The insurgency in Western Ukraine in World War II was the largest in all of Europe. At the time, the terrain of an insurgency was far less propitious in Eastern Ukraine, but this is no longer the case. All these prospects are frightening, but no matter what happens in the short and middle run, my sense is that Russia has lost Ukraine forever. Thank you. And now we have a lot of questions. Let me start. There were a couple of questions regarding Russian public opinion. Any prospects that Putin would be able to sell to his population that the war is a just war and the effect it has on public opinion. So maybe we'll go back to Sam, since you were trying to make a point at the 10-minute mark on public opinion.
Thanks. So, public opinion, obviously, in Russia is a problematic phenomenon, right? And that is, it's difficult to measure, and even when we do measure it, it's difficult to interpret. We had polls, including some reasonably reliable polls, leading right up to the end of 2021. Suggesting that despite 8 years of war with Ukraine and 8 years of pretty concerted state propaganda, in most cases, actually much more strident than anything Putin was saying up until the last couple of months, they had essentially failed to build a constituency for anything that would look like war. In fact, that was part of the argument against a war, right? Even polls done by things like the Public Opinion Foundation, FOAM, right, that are loyal to the Kremlin, right? They asked a question just before the war about what do you consider to be Putin's biggest foreign policy failures. Relations with Ukraine were number one, relations with the West and sanctions were number two. Right? I think that in part explains the emotional content of a lot of the emotional tenor, right, of a lot of what Putin was saying, right? His two speeches, particularly the long speech on the recognition of the separatist regions, was to me remarkable for its difference from the speech in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. Right, that was a speech that, Putin never really smiles in public, right? But it was a speech that was meant to make people happy, right? This was a speech that was meant to make people angry. What's also remarkable is that they haven't run with it. Right. So yes, some of the TV and the political talk shows have continued to talk around these themes, right? But back in 2013, 2014, the Euromaidan, the aftermath of the Euromaidan, television news in Russia was all Ukraine all the time, right? They moved Spokojnie Noche Malachi to a different television channel, right? So they could have an extra hour of TV after the evening news every day, and it really was dominated by Ukraine. That's not the case now. Right. So a lot of Russians remain somewhat unaware that this war is going on, and mostly unaware of the contours of the war. Right. So my answer to the question of can they justify it? Well, they're not really trying. Right. They're trying to make people think that this is a minor operation. That anything they are seeing is fake news. We've seen already that they've blocked Twitter, essentially blocked Facebook, are probably going to block YouTube. They've blocked Echo Moskvy and Dozhd. They will probably block Meduza in a matter of hours if they haven't done it while we were speaking. So the information space is contracting quite significantly. We're expecting prosecutions on charges of treason for anybody who dares to try to break that information embargo. You do hear, I think we have seen some polls since the war began suggesting that somewhere in the range of 50 to 60% are in support, at the very least, of the recognition of the republics. You can't ask whether they're in support of the war, because if you talk about it as a war in any kind of public forum, you're fined for 5 million rubles, worth less than it was a week ago, but still significant. And that suggests that yes, there is support, but it's the kind of, I think, passive and residual support that you would expect essentially for anything that Putin does, right? And I think that again is socially constructed and socially motivated support, right? It's support about remaining in line with what you take to be the prevailing opinion around you, right? Rather than any real cognitive engagement or even emotional engagement with what's going on.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Maybe a question for Marlene, although maybe Sam would have something to say about that as well. The televised Security Council meeting of Monday of last week, it seems already an eternity ago, was fascinating. Was the purpose of televising it to tie the elite to a decision that had already been taken? And therefore tie their face to Putin as a final warning to the West, or something else?
Yeah, that was a painful moment to watch, I think, in all senses. Even if I dislike Naryshkin, I was really feeling like he's really in big pain in trying to answer. I think the goal was to try to stage, and the way it was staged, I think, didn't really reach its goal, to stage the kind of solidarity and consensus of the Security Council around the decision. But I think first we could see that there was not full consensus, that getting the kind of the narrative right was difficult for many of the members. So I think it failed. And that's even more surprising that we know now that it was pre-recorded. So it could have been edited better. So there was also probably a strategy of punishing by kind of public humiliation those like Naryshkin who couldn't make it right. And I think that's telling us a lot about the atmosphere inside what is already a very close circle, is that there was not consensus, or the consensus was difficult to obtain. I think many of these members realized what they were doing and what could have been potentially the risk. So I think it's, for me, I read it as a sign of like the elites were, for even that circles were kind of forced to the decision. Maybe Sam or Keith would add something.
Thank you. Maybe a question for Keith, since you've been working for a long time on these issues of insurgencies and resistance. Question from our friend Max Berkholz here in Concordia. I say here because I'm in Montreal also at the moment. How do you see the dynamics of violence unfolding in the coming weeks and months? And how do you see these dynamics influencing the prospects for escalation of the conflict, or a move towards de-escalation? So what are likely scenarios, Keith?
So I think what we've mostly seen so far is regular Ukrainian military forces doing the fighting. And so I don't perhaps it's just because the Russians haven't occupied enough territory, but they've actually occupied quite a lot of territory in the south and east. And we're not seeing armed resistance from the civilian populations. And so, the lesson from the Second World War would be that you really need almost universal local support for an insurgency, and that really mounting an insurgency, aside from this window in sort of maybe 100 days after the occupation, where there's a whole sort of cleanup operation that takes place by the occupying force, something that persists over time requires a pretty strong organization, and the OUN was that organization in the western areas of Ukraine. But it also requires, forests, swamps, mountains, somewhere where you can organize. And so I think an urban terrorist movement might be a possibility, but I don't think we're likely to see anything like the uOttawa in this case. And so, but I also think that that's not the most effective form of resistance, and withdrawing administrative support without violence, on the theme of like damoy, 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 repeated over and over again, is likely to actually be far more effective because the occupying power does need to govern. Now, I do worry, like Sam, I was wrong. I wasn't wrong about the invasion, which I did think was going to happen in the event that Minsk was not implemented. But I also thought there would be more defection. I thought the Russians would have done some more advanced work in pulling away local administrations and local oligarchs. And that because of high levels of corruption in Ukraine, that signaled to me that people might be more self-interested than nationally interested, that they might not be willing to make any sacrifices for the state if they were offered a comfortable position after a Russian occupation. So I thought there might be some tipping. We have not seen anything like that, but we might. In other words, there might be something like that that happens later on. But there just seems to be such broad popular disgust, frankly. And if the violence of this invasion increases, which it will have to if it's going to be successful, that's going to turn the population away even more. And I think that's going to be a hard thing for people to collaborate with.
Thank you. Question for Tanya. Observing the digital space during the war, have you seen a split between the support or reluctance of the Russian government narrative in metropolitan areas, within Russia and rural areas? Is the digitalization gap between different areas within Russia noticeable regarding how much traction and support the official government narrative of current events has with Russian citizens? So the whole urban-rural divide.
I don't think it's necessarily particularly an urban-rural divide, because I mean, obviously, if we're talking about like extreme rural, then yeah, probably not a lot of people are on Instagram, although who knows. I think it's more along the lines of what Sam mentioned earlier about the fact that there really isn't much of a narrative at the moment, and there's just not much coverage of the war or any sort of like explanations of why it's happening. They're very limited, and I think that again leaves space. Obviously, if people aren't online much or don't have access to independent media or don't consume them, then they're seeing one picture and they perhaps might just not be aware of what's happening or what's actually happening or to what extent. I think, though, even among the people who do have access to information, either through social media, or let's not forget also that a lot of people in Russia have relatives in Ukraine. And, there have been a lot of reports about people having very difficult conversations with their extended families in Russia, and just some being horrified at what's happening and others just kind of not, almost being in disbelief and saying, no, they're going to go away, in 2 days, or something like that. So I think it's really more about how keyed in people are into kind of, I guess, the current affairs and news agenda overall. And yes, to some extent, their political position as to, whether they support the current government or not, or if they're in opposition, but also in terms of, how much, as we say, how much do they believe, even if they do know what Russia is doing, or to some extent know, how much do they believe it's actually, a catastrophe, or it's, these are war crimes we're talking about. So I think it's very much dependent, not just on what people have access to, but also in terms of like, sources of news or whatever, but also what they allow themselves to have access to in terms of the imaginaries of what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening in Russia. And then, of course, we have the significant part of the population, which, they're in the hierarchy of needs. All they care about is having enough money for food and shelter, and they don't really care about what's going on anywhere else, even in kind of the Russian political space, and that's why like that, and that's obviously a conversation about Russian mobilization inside Russia and such, but I think there are connections. So I think it varies widely. I mean, there are lots of Instagram influencers where, when partisan Ukrainians send them messages with information and photos about what's going on, they just kind of are appalled, and they're like, don't, we're talking here about beauty tips, don't send us your pictures of Ukrainians and dead Russians or whatever. So I think it's much more complicated than just the urban-rural divide.
Thank you. I'll take the next one from our friend Jose Casanova. Amazing to see social scientists still analyzing everything from the perspective of the Imperial Colonial Center without using any of the analytical frameworks of post-imperialism and post-colonialism. I'm sure my answer will be inadequate, but let me share something. Of course, I'm familiar with in the Ukrainian narrative among many of our colleagues of having adopted these lenses is basically that the way Russians have been looking at Ukrainians historically is very colonial. I mean, just denying yourself, your national identity. But in the sinister speech of Putin on the Monday before he waged war, and as we found out, the second speech when he actually launched the war was taped immediately after, so we're kind of has to be seen as the same speech. One of the things that particularly depressed or struck me, the whole thing was highly depressing, was how further he went on the colonial perspective, in a sense. It was, of course, in his mind, Ukraine doesn't exist, the nationalists are artificial and they're fascist. We knew that already, although it's chilling to hear when 200,000 soldiers are massed at the borders. But he spent quite a bit of time, several minutes, to tell us how Ukrainians are incapable of governing themselves because they're so corrupt, even though Transparency International actually put Russia even more at the bottom than Ukraine. Of course, there's corruption in Ukraine, but that he insisted on that it's not only a artificially radical nationalist fascist government, but it's also like denationalized in a sense because they can't even govern, they're just stealing and so forth. That to me is colonialism 101. It's basically you can't govern yourself, so we have to do it for you. That may not be very theoretical, but that was certainly my gut reaction. For the first time, maybe I shouldn't have seen it before, said, okay, that the message is crystal clear. And indeed, it goes beyond nationalism or the denial of it. On defections, of course, you had massive defections in Crimea. It was basically, Crimea, unfortunately, was a kind of not quite hostile takeover. I mean, in much of the state, including the Navy, just defected, just switched, they became Russians, and without any combat. But that was not the story in Donbass at all. Actually, the state did not defect. The Party of Regions didn't defect. Nobody defected. Well, there were some exceptions, but essentially, these proto-states, these would-be states, they had to create parallel institutions. But what my colleague Jesse Driscoll and I have been working on a book for many, many years that will finally come out later this year on the war in Donbass. And what was particularly striking is how improvised was everything that Russia did in 2014. It was complete reaction, and they had no clue of who the players were on the ground, even in Crimea initially, and certainly in Donbass. They had no clue. I'm not talking 4 or 5 months down later, at the beginning. So when we were hearing in January, early February, these reports from US intelligence, British intelligence, you've got like possible, coup or these new regions types that would take over, etc. My reaction is that they probably have no clue still, even though they have certainly possibly all the capabilities of infiltrating Ukrainian society. They probably still have no clue who the players are. And we're seeing now in real time the reality of, well, the real Ukrainians are actually not just refusing to fight or defecting. And that appears to be a surprise to the Russian decisions maker, beginning with Putin. So it has to be a consequence of the hubris, just the contempt that essentially this whole thing is not real. Once we take care of the problem, the real Ukrainians will emerge. The expectations in 2014, once Crimea was annexed, that would be that half of Ukraine, so Eastern Ukraine, would basically collapse on its own, which didn't happen. In any case, that's my 2 cents on defections. Let me.
Can I put 2 cents in on that too? Because I don't think it's right to say, because I did think that there would be more defection than there has. And I don't think that I'm in the same classification as Putin. And I think, it's not like you have to say that there's no such thing as France in order to recognize that you had a Vichy regime under the Nazis, right? Like collaboration is often a phenomenon. That you take, the political divisions within the occupied power and you favor one faction and bring them back, like Pétain, right, in France. And so it wasn't inconceivable that they could have done some preparatory work. But I think you're right. I actually think that 2022 isn't that much different from 2014. And they just went in blind on assumptions without actually, and those assumptions were wrong. Especially now.
Let me move it back to Sam. There is a question about, let's say, worst case scenario, and we have this huge problem that what if the civil service just doesn't want to govern, right? There's this kind of silent refusal. But if we get to the point of military control of most likely a further partition Ukraine, what would be the scenarios then of Western policy with these kind of through the roof sanctions and boycotts and so forth?
Well, certainly the sanctions, I think, would not be rolled back, right? And I think that, we would probably see what we saw less in recent years, but more in sort of, you think the period between 2014, 2018, when sanctions were continually being tweaked, right? Particularly sanctions enforcement was being tweaked by Treasury and by the EU and by London as people sought to evade them from one side, and government sought to prevent them from being evaded from the other, right? The compliance risk keeps getting ramped up for particularly Western financial corporations. And I think there will be concerted effort essentially to turn well, back up for a second. These sanctions are very different than the sanctions we've had since 2014, right? These are targeted at the Russian economy as a whole, right? They are targeted to create pain. They are not targeted as a deterrent anymore. I can't find anybody in Washington or London who actually thinks that these could, if there's anything left to deter, frankly, but also that these would serve that purpose. They're about punishment, and they're frankly, although governments won't say it, they're about regime change. Right, they're about trying to force both the Russian elite and Russian citizens to reconsider what their futures might look like if they had a change of leadership. Not saying anything about whether that would work, but that's the purpose. So there will, I think, be a concerted effort to turn the Russian economy into something like the Iranian economy, as we've seen with Iran and North Korea and other places around the world. In the US and even in Europe, there is considerable appetite, right, for long periods of time. Cuba, right, for impoverishing other countries for political reasons. In this case, maybe for a good reason. So I think from the Western standpoint, I don't see that as too much of a problem. It'll force some other adjustments. It'll probably force an adjustment to policy on Iran, right? Iranian gas will begin to look much more appetizing. I think, coming back to some of the things that have been said earlier, I mean, I would agree with everybody that actually holding Ukraine is going to be a whole lot harder than taking it. Part of the problem for Moscow is that there is no analytical community in Russia focused on Ukraine. There has not been since the end of the Soviet Union. Nobody studies it. It's probably even less studied than Canada is in the US. And that is based on some very fundamental, almost unthinking assumptions, right? About how well we must know it simply because it's right there and it's always been part of us. There's no funding that's ever gone into it, and that showed up in the mistakes they made in 2004, 2005. It showed up in the mistakes they made in 2014, and it shows up in the mistakes they made now. So even if they wanted to essentially impose rule from Moscow, right, without having to rely too much on people who know the landscape in Ukraine, I don't know where they're going to find those people. I don't know where they're going to find the people to police it, right? They, need Rosgvardia, which has already been fairly hard hit from what we can tell. They need Rosgvardia at home, and periodically they need it in Belarus and Kazakhstan and other places, potentially as well, right? It's very hard for me to see anything other than a pretty catastrophic follow-on from this. They would not be the first country to occupy somebody and have catastrophic consequences because they misunderstood how hard it would be, right? Most people don't tend to do it in a rather large country that's right on their border, and I think that's also going to cause some difficulties. But I'm less worried about Western resolve than I am about the potential escalation of mistakes and then overreactions to those mistakes that we're going to see as a result of this.
All right, thank you. I have one, even though Marlene is not a military expert, I think she can take that one from our friend Jeffrey Kopstein. Why has Russia not used its Air Force advantage more effectively than it has? Why has it not attacked Ukraine's electric grid or in the big cities? Is it because of Putin's view of it as quote unquote Russia and therefore domestic, which is Keith's point? At one point, well, he's asking Keith, but I think Marlene could answer also. Would you say we would be justified in saying Putin does not view it that way? How much damage and death? At some point, it's hard to argue you are saving the place if you are killing a lot of the people you claim to be saving. The point here, it's not necessarily like a military argument here. It's mostly he's attacking what he represents to be the Russian world. He's not attacking Western Ukraine at the moment, which is completely outside of the Russian world. So Ruski Mir. Marlene.
Yeah, I think that's one of the paradoxes to imagine that Kiev could be destroyed very soon, why it's the mother of Russian cities. So if the goal is to bring it back in the homeland, what is the point of destroying the historical homeland of or birthplace of the nation? And I think that's part of the contradiction that we see. The more military aspect for me, my point would be that I'm not sure the military was ready. I'm not sure what they were really told. I'm not sure they really understood they are preparing for war. Maybe they thought they were just that at the beginning first for impressing the West, then maybe for doing a small operation in the Donbass. I'm not sure. I mean, for all the information we have about their issues with food logistics, fuel, and so on, I don't think they were prepared for understanding. I'm even not sure who in the military, at which level, understood that it will be a big scale operation. There are missing men. There are a lot of things that show that there is certain level of unpreparedness, which may be part of this kind of pyramid of power and how decisions are taken that has contributed to the situation. But yeah, the kind of symbolic aspect is a very difficult to understand. But I think the idea in Putin's vision is that You know, you have to re-educate those who don't know that they are part of the nation. So re-education will be costly. So you can destroy part of those who should be under your control until they realize that they are a part of your Russian world.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes to go. Back to Keith from Marek Brzezinski. In the absence of places to organize insurgency on Ukrainian territory, what you implied, Keith, was the terrain was propitious, particularly in northern Galicia and Volhynia, because of the swamp and the forest, but a lot of Ukraine, of course, is steppes. Could a safe haven appear in neighboring Poland? And if so, could that dramatically increase the prospects of a Russia-NATO war clash?
Yes, and I think that the decision to walk back the transfer of those 70 aircraft and have them depart from an airbase in Poland that was discussed this past week was done largely because I think there was reasonable concern and perhaps even expectation that Russia would initiate a tactical nuclear strike against that Polish airbase, and then we would really have a crisis on our hands. I mean, this is terrible, but I think Russia, in some ways, would like this crisis to escalate and would like to show resolve. Is not likely to use tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory, but I think that they would have an added-on effect of testing NATO, especially since NATO has done everything short of military intervention in this case. And so I think having bases of operations for Ukrainian insurgents that slip across the border or go through the Pripyat marshes and things like that, that's kind of romantic stuff for people. And I see a lot of that thinking on Twitter. But I think that the Russian response would put us in an even worse situation than we are now. And this is the thing. Russia can titrate up the repression, and I worry both the repression inside Russia, as Sam and Marlene were suggesting, but the repression in Ukraine. If they have to use a high level of violence to maintain control, they will have an easier time doing that if they're facing a violent insurgency. I think it's much harder to shoot people and put them in camps when you have just regular people like their parents and uncles and siblings walking out without arms and saying, guys, go home. Like, what are you doing here? That's going to be far more effective, and just not picking up the trash, not doing the things that governance requires, these sort of mundane tasks, that will be far more effective than armed resistance. In some ways, armed resistance, as you pointed out, Dominique, feeds a Russian narrative, right? Then they're fighting the Banderovцы, right? Then it is this kind of World War II scenario promoted by the West, with bases over the border in Poland. We don't really want to feed that narrative, I think, in this case.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes left, so we'll leave it to Tanya, our communication person here. There's a question on Zelensky, and then I think it's fair to say that in the first week of the war, Ukraine overwhelmingly has won the information war, at least internationally. In Russia, we don't know, but internationally, and Zelensky's at the center of it. So your thoughts in 2 minutes.
I think it's Zelensky, and then just the fact that he's staying there and making himself visible and being kind of a very real human, right? Like when you see him in interviews, you can see that he's tired, he has bags under his eyes, he's unshaven. I think that's incredibly powerful, but also whoever helps him write his speeches, I hope he's paying those people incredibly well, because they've been very succinct, they've been very aware. And I think they've also used the developing situation incredibly well, right? I mean, you bomb the TV tower, you also bomb Babin Yar, yeah, he's going to mention it. You call him, you say you came to denazify, you bet he's going to mention his Jewish heritage. So I think like just the, being very aware, being very kind of ready to embrace the context and making the best use of it, I think has served him really well. And I think, to some extent, the fact that people maybe didn't expect that much from him also played in his favor, because he's overperformed. And I think he's, his position even inside Ukraine, obviously, as the polls show now, is incredibly strong and much stronger than it was. So, I think let him keep doing what he's doing.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for the panel. Thank you for the audience. That was a great session. And we can only, we have to hope for the best and expect for the worst. I think that was in one of the Bourne movies, but this is real. This is not a movie. This is real. Thank you very much. Let me repeat that we will have another extraordinary last minute. Everything is last minute these days. Virtual ASN event on Monday, next Monday at 1 p.m. Voices from Ukraine under siege, with scholars in Ukraine, and essentially sharing their experience. So the full lineup will be announced hopefully within 24 hours, and we hope to see you there. I want to thank Tanya, Keith, Sam, Marlene, and Lisa and Lucine on the production team, and Zsuzsa for a great session. Maybe I should say Slava Ukraini. Thank you.